Welcome to the Writing Westward podcast. I'm your host, Brendan Rensink. Today we'll be talking about water with Professor Eric P. Perramond and his book Unsettled Waters, Rights, Law, and Identity in the American West. Writing Westward is a production of the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. Each episode features a conversation with an author or scholar of new works that explore the North American West. We hope that our discussions will spark your curiosity to learn more and think differently about the North American West as a region and its peoples, environments, histories, literature, and so forth. You can follow Writing Westward on Facebook at Writing Westward Podcast or on Twitter at Writing West. You can listen on our website, writingwestward.org, or subscribe and listen wherever you get your podcasts. We're listed on most major distributors. To learn more about the Redd Center, our programming, live-streamed lectures, funding opportunities for research and events, or anything else, find us at reddcenter.byu.edu. That's reddcenter.byu.edu. You can get more regular updates about the Redd Center on Facebook and Twitter as well. Thanks for listening. Back in episode 4, we spoke about wildfire in the American West as an inescapable history that the region must continually reckon with in the present. In elemental opposition to fire, water in the West is a historical topic and present reality that should likely demand even more of our attention. Much of Euro-American interactions with the West and perceptions of it were defined by the West's waters, or lack thereof. There are many pockets of exceptionally wet places in the West, but wide swaths are environmentally shaped by its aridity. Naturally, the human societies that have thrived and collapsed in the American West have often organized their economics, culture, politics, and laws around water resources. We'll dip our toes into this topic, forgive the pun, for today's episode with Eric P. Perramond, professor of environmental science and Southwest studies at Colorado College. A geographer by training, Perramond uses ethnography, oral history, archival diggings, and an extensive wrestling with complex legal histories to examine how New Mexico and New Mexicans have used water, organized and managed it as a scarce resource, built identities around it, and over the course of the past century and into the present, legally defined who has rights to the water and how much. His book, Unsettled Waters, Rights, Law, and Identity in the American West, was published by the University of California Press in 2019. In Unsettled Waters, Perramond introduces us to New Mexico's Office of the State Engineer and a legal process called Adjudication, wherein, via lawsuit, the state maps and measures water as a public good and assigns private usage rights to it. Adjudication considers historic and contemporary usage and claims, but it is a one-time process that sets those rights in stone. For communities that have managed water collectively through acequia ditch systems that are flexible and adaptable, that entail participatory labor and some level of democratic decision-making, the inflexibility and finality of state-defined water rights is concerning. Though the amounts of water are small, they are essential to those who use them. In basins where sovereign indigenous nations also have different water rights and bring different federal jurisdictions and negotiators to these lawsuits, or growing urban and suburban populations are also demanding water, adjudication processes have dragged on for decades. Perramond's work may be situated in the very unique geography and context of New Mexico legal battles, but the conclusions he draws about how Western populations need to think carefully about water usage and management are universal for the region. Our Western climate offers us no promises of how much water we will have from one season to the next, or where it will be available. Thus, our relationship to it and management efforts should be paramount and probably more prominent than they are in our current Western public discourse and debate. Professor Eric Perramond, thank you for joining us on the podcast this morning.
Thanks, Brendan. I really appreciate your time and efforts here, and it's great to be part of this series.
Yeah, we had an episode a while back on fire, which was at the top of my list of topics I wanted to cover. And immediately after that, I said, I need to do an episode on water. So I started hunting for books, and yours came up quickly. I'm really excited to be able to kind of talk about this other big environmental issue that's so important for the West.
Well, I appreciate it, and given who you spoke with on fire, Stephen Pine, it's a humbling business to be included in the same series. So I'll do my best.
To speak broadly about the history of water in the West, when I when I teach about water in the West, we often land on John Wesley Powell in our discussions in class, and he came through in the 19th century and wrote this big report, sent it back to D.C. and said, the West is a different place. We can't, the water infrastructure and regimes and settlement patterns that we use in the humid Midwest and East won't work out here in the West. We didn't quite listen, did we, Eric?
Not exactly. And, in some ways, I think Powell was both too early to be listened to in terms of a 20th century kind of ethic or aesthetic on water issues that I think most of us would be a little more open to thinking about these days. But I also think in some ways, what we get wrong is he actually came too late to the issue and tried to move the policy well after the Homestead Act was in full effect, well after most territorial governors were in place and thinking geometrically rather than in terms of watershed shape. And I think Powell's legacy is a powerful one, but I'm sometimes more skeptical that his legacy is the one that we think it is, especially in Western historical circles. So I'm a huge fan of his, obviously his expedition, the bravery, but I have actually become more interested in his work at the Bureau of Ethnology, his work in guiding sort of early anthropology in the West, such as it was.
Yeah, he had a whole career after.
Exactly.
His expeditions,
after he critiqued and was basically ignored by the Western early water buffalo policymakers and politicians at the time who didn't want to hear it about limiting settlement in the West because of aridity. They moved him on to other roles where perhaps unknowingly he actually did a lot more good than they thought he was going to be able to do. And his eventual role, at Reclamation, really, and sort of USGS, he was able to start the first hydrology boot camp, which I write about in Unsettled Waters, right there to, Embudo Station, which today is, a nearly broken down log cabin, but now running a restaurant and has been for, several decades. They've tried to revive that structure. But there, Frederick Newell ran his first hydrography camp to try to train a new generation of water experts. So the legacy of Powell is pretty distinctive, but I think we sometimes overemphasize his, if we'd only listened to him on his wisdom of political watersheds and organizing the West in, non-Cartesian ways. And, there's a lot more that he did that I think is a longer lasting direct measure on agencies and policy measures. And so that was, in some ways, I included him just to be able to kind of deflect to a different angle for the audience, hopefully, and I hope that message doesn't get lost. But yeah, what a influential person. But this story starts earlier, and that's really my major point in writing this book. So.
Yeah, we're gonna dig through some of these historic water use systems in New Mexico. But when Powell and other Anglo-Americans arrive on the scene in the arid West, be it New Mexico or you're in Colorado, right?
That's right.
There's a lot of arid regions in Colorado. I'm in Utah, and we're dry as a bone. This year maybe was the anomaly, but quite dry. But there have been people living here for a long time before who developed some very complex systems to deal with water, and we'll get to some of those.
Yeah.
But all this talk about how important water is, I'm always struck by how divorced many Westerners, especially those of us who live in urban or suburban settings, how divorced we are from the realities of water scarcity. I can turn on the tap and water comes out. The rate, maybe my water rates go up, but those of us who don't live in agricultural settings or rural settings where people are living off well water, we don't quite get it, do we?
No, and I think that's where even for those of us who live with the privilege of urban water and turning on taps, as you put it, or just paying someone else to provide the water, we're actually rarely paying for the water itself, if ever. Most of that is conveyance, transportation, and utility costs. Rather than a cost for the water itself, which I think is one of the big problems we have. And it's also one of the biggest opportunities we have to shape a new kind of relationship with water, because if we're going to accept that water has a price. Okay, well, then it should have a price. And we can't have it both ways. It strikes me as a perfect paradox that here in the American West, where everyone is seemingly accepting of private enterprise and capitalism, that we want water for free, but everything else is privatized and has to be paid for in some direct or indirect way.
And more so than anywhere else in the country. I mean, here in the West, water infrastructure is an enormous undertaking, right? I mean, we're piping water not just across watersheds, but across states, and that costs something.
That's exactly right. And I think one of the fundamental points that, most Westerners who've lived here most of their life west of the Mississippi understand most of the time where their water comes from, but it still shocks me occasionally when I'm just talking to folks here in town in Colorado Springs that a lot of folks don't understand where their water's coming from, the western slope, and that 80% of the water in Colorado is coming west of the Front Range and then piped, through a series of 4, 5, 6 foot tunnels, basically, across the ranges to the Front Range where 80% of the population lies. So, we have it backwards in terms of a settlement history. And that's where I think that mismatch in time between land policy and water policy that Powell sort of rightly pointed out.
He was a few decades too late.
Smacks us. Exactly.
Yeah.
And, we settled down in these places that were easy because they were the first reachable places and they were on water courses, but we didn't at the time understand that, a Denver or, a Phoenix or a Colorado Springs would bloom to several 100,000 or 1 million people. And, that's the fundamental challenge. And I have to say that books like, Cadillac Desert, do a great service in understanding what infrastructure does for us, how much it's cost us and things, but it sort of underestimates how much hard work had to be done by folks whose job it was to provide water for ratepayers. And I have to flag, Patricia Limerick's book, The Addition Time, which is a very different project and almost a full-throated defense of urban water efforts in the West, which it took me by surprise in terms of the tone of it, but I think she has it right, is that we underestimate how much we owe those early urban infrastructure engineers and lawyers and city planners in providing those. So there's a lot that we underestimate and misunderstand about water, but yeah, it's too often taken for granted.
Well, let's move down to New Mexico then. I hesitate to ask for you to weigh in on the Colorado versus New Mexico chili debate and who makes the better chilies. I mean, you live in Colorado and you worked in New Mexico for this book, so maybe you'd be the most informed, but I have a feeling that'd probably just get you in trouble, wouldn't it?
It might, but I'm okay with the question because to me it doesn't in the end matter all that much. It matters only to the folks growing it and who eat it a lot. And if I had to defer, I would go with the New Mexico chili only because it was farmed and commercialized there, and they have their own sort of hatch green chili sort of fetish with this delicious dish. And I do admit to putting it on almost everything we are in New Mexico, whether that's a cheeseburger or tamales or my eggs. But I will say I do enjoy the Pueblo chili when it's available, and tends to have a different taste to it. But that's as far as I'm going to go.
All right. Well, I like them both.
Yeah, right.
I hope you don't get any picketers outside your office upset.
I kind of doubt it, and okay. I don't mind being thrown chili at. It's not like rotten eggs.
So, in your book, Unsettled Waters, you're looking at both the history, the deep history, recent history, present, and some of the future about water in New Mexico, water law, the rights people have to water, and then the ways that their relationships with water have shaped individual identities, community identities, inter-community relationships, all kinds of things. But all around the issue of water, paradoxically, the amounts of water that are being litigated are quite small, but as you lay out, very, very influential. Could we take a few minutes to talk about some of the different constituencies of water users in New Mexico that kind of fill out the cast of characters? Because you conducted a lot of kind of oral history interviews. A lot of this book is built off your field work of talking with
Yeah.
people. So let's talk about this cast of characters. So first, who would you like to start with?
Well, I think fundamentally I have to acknowledge that where I started in the work itself over a decade ago was asking some what I thought fairly innocent questions at the time, hoping to produce some, brief high country news piece about the status of acequias and how they were dealing or not dealing with climate change issues. And, as I lay out early on in the book, I sort of asked an innocent question about
This is your opening vignette, right?
Oh, yes. Yeah. And, I was quickly corrected by someone on a ditch as we were walking in. And I sort of asked if these water rights were adjudicated. And I thought that was an innocent question. Little did I know that I just used the A word, adjudication. Miguel sort of turned around and looked at me in the eye, and he's like, who wants to know? And so I think there's a double entry point there. One is that I acknowledge I started with, largely Hispano village acequias, the ditches that run throughout New Mexico, which total somewhere between 800 and 900. There's never been a thorough kind of census of these things. People have tried, but what constitutes a single ditch is sometimes tricky work to count.
Could you explain the hydrology and history of the acequia system?
Yeah.
Some rural Westerners are familiar with ditch irrigation systems.
Yeah.
But this is something much older and a little bit unique in how it's administered.
Yeah, and I'll go back a little bit because much of what I've learned early on was from the New Mexican intelligentsia of Jose Rivera, Sylvia Rodriguez, a later arrival, Stanley Crawford, who wrote about this in Mayordomo. But acequias are community ditches that are organized around watersheds, and they really stem all the way back to the Middle East, roughly put. But you can find these kinds of systems in Nepal and northern India. I mean, it has a longevity to it. So the absolute origins of acequias is a little murky, but it is an irrigation system that is, again, village-based, community-based, not exactly perfectly egalitarian, but it is both a reference to the ditch, the physical ditch itself, that diverts naturally from a stream course with something as simple as a few rocks. These days, they tend to be more concrete outtakes and ditches that then line along an earthen ditch to deliver water to people's fields. And the people who live along the acequia are called parciantes, as in shareholders or parcel owners or partial owners. And there's always a supervisor, a mayordomo, who takes care of business and allocates water, especially when times are scarce. But it is a system with centuries, if not millennia, of experience, sort of adaptability, and a kind of longevity and flexibility in the system that I think most, even Western engineers would envy in terms of its long-term functionality, even if sometimes I've heard, shall we say, more modern water experts look down on it and call it, primitive or primordial or early or inefficient. But, it depends on what efficiency means and what do we value in terms of that efficiency. So it goes way back, and I think it's one of the kind of shadow infrastructure and landscape cultural histories that a lot of folks just don't know about in this country. And I've always been fascinated with them. I ran into them first time in the early 90s. So going back to when we first moved out here to Colorado College in 2005, I thought, well, I'll start with a regional project that's in, my backyard, so to speak, and go down to New Mexico and explore these acequias. And once I asked that adjudication question, I was quickly down the rabbit hole of trying to understand what was happening on these ditches because or despite these adjudication procedures, which are basically court cases that are handled very differently across each Western state. Because, as you know, we have no national water policy for quantity. Mm-hmm. We have the Clean Water Act of the late 60s, but that's it. And so each state in the country is left to its own devices to figure out, well, how do you want to allocate water use, ownership, rights? Do states own the water? Do they give absolute private property rights? So But that's where I started, is along these acequias. And it's not to say that the prior peoples who had long been in place in the Southwest, whether that's the various Pueblo native sovereigns, the Diné, the Navajo, the Ute peoples of
Apaches.
originally this state,
Yeah.
would have had water use of some sort. And in many cases they had ditch offtakes, floodwater farming. I think the extent of it is still, we're in the early stages of knowing how fully complex that was. But certainly you have, if you go back another 1,000 years, you have the Hohokam in southern Arizona who had a fairly vast network, of irrigation networks in southern Arizona through Tucson and Phoenix. And so this was not new. And one of my fundamental goals with the book was really trying to get people to understand that this is a great case to think about New Mexico, because it's one of the few states where you have these three overlapping water cultures, indigenous, first colonizer, Spanish, Mexican indigenous layer, and then the later Anglo-American period, that all pretend in some ways to know what their legal rights are. They all pretend to be in charge of water. And yet a lot of those conceptions and how they think about water are in some ways irreconcilable. And so to force that into an adjudication into court illuminates the entire set of conflicts and overlapping layers and where the similarities and real differences are.
So when does adjudication starts in the early 1900s in New Mexico, correct?
Yeah, and this is the fascinating part, is that, each state handles it very differently. So when I looked at Colorado, they said, well, it's considered fully adjudicated, but that's also because it's individually driven. So individuals have to present their water rights to a local district court. There's 7 divisions in Colorado that handle these, and these are state courts where a judge also plays water judge as well. It's a very different system that's petitioned individually, and then they oversee that, and it can be updated. So it's kind of an organic living adjudication. And it's really considered fully adjudicated at this point, even if there are changes. In New Mexico, the process is far different, because what they're trying to do is what's called a general stream adjudication. But there is nothing general about it. It's very specific. It's very demanding. And it's a bit like taking a 1-to-1 time-space ratio census of where water is, who owns it, what it's being used for at any particular time. And like a lot of Western states, most of those updates, if something was adjudicated in the 1930s and 60s, well, let's say it's not exactly living or updated quickly. Mm-hmm. And it's a legal administrative process where the Attorney General and the Office of the State Engineer decide to file suit for any watershed or sub-watershed. And basically everyone then gets sued to prove their water rights. And you start getting correspondence from the state of New Mexico about proving your water rights. And so they do extensive research prior to that and send out letters of offer. But as you can imagine, in a state that's had 2 separate colonial legacies of lost resources, lost land, first the indigenous peoples who were stripped away from their access and cultural existence in some ways. And then once the Anglos started doing that to both peoples, both Pueblos and Hispanos, you can imagine it might get complicated to try to send out legal papers, at first in English, to speakers of multiple languages in a state that was culturally diverse and very suspicious of any new state efforts to try to control and map out resources for them.
And now they're coming for their water.
That is the perception, right?
So this is why when you were speaking with Miguel and you mentioned adjudication, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up, right? Because he was in a non-adjudic. There are still many watersheds and basins that have not been adjudicated.
In fact, most basins are not adjudicated yet and are barely in the process stages at this point. Something like 1/3 of the surface area has been adjudicated in New Mexico. And it's not to say that the Office of State Engineer doesn't have individual water rights sort of well understood for 70 or 80% of the state, but in terms of a basin level picture that's been processed through a court supervised by a judge, it's early days. And that's the shocking part, is when I came to this, I thought, wait, there's a 1907 water code that even precedes the existence of the state of New Mexico, which is 1912.
That's right. It's still
And
a territory. Yeah.
And they've been adjudicating since then. So I just thought, oh, this is hilarious. This is a bit like a Luis Borges short story or a C.S. Lewis short story about, producing a one-to-one map that blots out the sun, because it duplicates the very existence of New Mexico as we know it in time in the 20th century and into the 21st. And it's just been a massive effort. And to try to do this in a state that has always been resource poor, shall we say, is a vast undertaking, and the office has always been understaffed for this purpose at the OSE, the Office of the State Engineer. So, reading through some of the early archival reports from the territorial engineer, as he was called for the first, decade or so of his office existence, are pretty tragicomic. You have this one person who's left to his own devices, can't even afford a desk, not provisioned by the state in any kind of revenue or compensation, and he's asked to create a census of this vast western rectangular arid state to try to find the waters that are being used and what might be left over. I mean, it's easy to kind of judge in retrospect, but that's one of those human stories that I think it's hard to forget once you start looking at the minutiae of who's doing the work.
It's a nice, clean, square state, but covered with very not square watersheds and mountains and basins and sub-basins, and
right,
quite the task. So we have these three groups, the acequia systems, which span across a lot of the state. You have native sovereigns, some of which are using acequia systems.
Correct.
But their legal rights and legal relationships with the federal and state governments are very different than those who are not claiming native heritage.
Quite.
The other stakeholder that you haven't really mentioned is then kind of just the growing, regardless of ethnicity, the growing kind of urban suburban population, the cities.
That's right.
Who want water not for agricultural use, but for drinking water.
Right. And, in some ways it's, I don't want to get into our national political dimensions here, but in some ways it mimics in some ways what is an increasingly frayed urban-rural relationship rather than a frayed state-to-state or blue-red partisan relationship. Is that this is what we get wrong about the story of this, is that most agricultural water users are just deathly afraid that cities will come in, swoop in, buy their water rights, and that's that. And it's, even if it doesn't affect them directly, if they're not selling out, quote unquote, their water rights, if you're on a shared ditch and part of that flow is diminished and has to be retired because of purchase of water rights, that's the real concern. And so, whether it's the Pueblo have a little less to worry about because they have federally reserved rights that cannot be expunged or sold once they're secured. But it's the federal government's job to oversee that and to protect it. There's a trustee and sovereign of sovereigns relationship there that, and I'm being quite literal here, that non-Indians, this is how they're phrased in the law, anybody who's not Pueblo, not Diné, not part of a reservation group, has to deal still with state water law. And so the Office of State Engineer has leeway and oversight over anybody who is a non-Indian, whether you are mixed indigenous heritage living off res, whether you are an Hispano whose descendants go back to early 1600s in the original foundation of the what would have been Nuevo Mexico at the time. And then also Anglo-Americans and anybody else who came along. So it's a real cleaving of identity that then parcels out the jurisdiction of water and what rules you have to abide by. And I try to make that clear.
Yeah.
But I still feel like I'm in the early drafts of my own understanding of this.
It's a mess. It is a mess of a system, which is maybe why it's, 100 years after it started, they're still trying to work their way through some of these cases. When the state comes in and says, okay, we're going to adjudicate this watershed or this basin, this region, what's the process? And all of the region's water users, get these letters. They're basically being brought into a lawsuit by the state saying you need to come in and prove what rights you have to water, how much you've used historically, how much you're using now, so that the state can apportion those rights kind of in official form in writing and then sell the surplus. That's kind of
Right.
the big picture. So if you are an acequia user, what do you have to do the next day? What is the process that these often very kind of small town rural, I mean, often not people of great means, what is it that they have to
Yeah.
then do to, in the short and long term, secure their rights to water?
Right. That's the $64,000 question, and in some ways, it's the fundamental departure for misunderstandings, because from a state level, expert level, liberal rights, economics view of someone who's a politician, this all seems like, well, this is what a state does, is offer its citizens certified rights to what we consider private property. Well, okay, but that fundamentally assumes that water or water rights are a private property as opposed to one held in trust by a community. So first aspect to this is that, even if you get an offer of judgment, which is typically what it's called, it was a letter from the state, and they would say, well, we've done research on your parcel of 2 acres. We think you are deserving of 6.2 acre feet per year.
Is that the first notice they get?
That is usually the first notice they get.
So unbeknownst to them, the state has already been researching their water rights.
Oh, absolutely. And early on, it was a sudden shock to get these kinds of letters. The process changed over time to one where they would be notified that the basin was going to be adjudicated, and to start to prepare for that. The second letter would then start with offers of judgment at the individual level. So it's not to say that the process hasn't changed over time, just like everything else.
Does this impact how people then start using water? Do they all start upping their water usage as a way to kind of quickly prove that they – right? It turns this into more of a competitive scene than than a cooperative one.
Yeah, and I think depending on how and when the adjudication was done, what the perceptions from certain users were. I mean, it's highly variable across New Mexico too, because watersheds are really different one from another. So if you have competing users or more than 2 cultures trying to share water, what adjudications, as early lawsuits did, was spark, let's say, a performance of water use that may or may not have reflected the actual water uses at the time. Because if you're going to have to prove your property rights ownership, and this would be across all cultures, of course people want to be seen working with the water, and people were absolutely intent on maximizing their water use to show that, yes, of course, we've always used it this way. This is what we're planning this year. It's water hungry. We need all the rights secured. And that gets especially dicey in watersheds like Taos and, the Pocoaque Valley, where you have native sovereigns, the Pueblo, whether that's Taos Pueblo up in Taos, or if you have Nambe and Santo Domingo Pueblo, all in the same watershed, and they're all going to be expecting full allocated rights. Well, so will the non-Indians who have shared that valley and depended on the same water. And so the early days of adjudication sparked serious use of water, and that's one of the things I try to make clear in the book. Now, whether that's something to make a big deal about, I'm more circumspect, because I think it's more of an instantaneous effect, that when you're being observed, of course, you're going to look busy. It's a bit like when the boss comes down the hall and everybody scrambles to be like, shut down your video games and get back to work. So I think part of this was a kind of momentary, spontaneous use of that water. But it certainly highlighted the fact that people understood that they had to be seen performing and doing work with water to be able to get the full provision of water. At least that was the perception.
But you do talk in various points about that it's not that adjudication suddenly threw these regions into conflict or competition,
no.
because there had been competing, water uses, for centuries, but that the adjudication process sometimes brought these things to the surface or made them more visible.
Yeah.
I found interesting, especially in cases like, say, in Taos, where Taos Pueblo, the headwaters of most of the water for that basin are on Taos Pueblo lands. Right? Correct? So they could, it would be their legal right to make a call on the entire, on all the water, correct?
Right.
And everyone living downstream has always known that, at least since Taos Pueblo, was granted rights by the U.S. government and so forth. So that there's always been kind of these latent not fears, but I assume paranoias about what if our native neighbors make a call on the river, which is their legal right to do. And now the adjudication process really brings that out.
That's exactly right. So to me, at least my way of thinking, looking at least the case for New Mexico of sort of centuries of water conflict, really, and accommodation and sharing arrangements, is that this is nothing new, but it was the latest new thing that served as a kind of legal catalyst for new conflicts or resurfacing old grudges, or at least recapitulating what might be more flexible arrangements for the future. So everyone had a stake in trying to maximize the claims and use terms that they might be awarded. And, again, this goes all the way back to Spanish colonial days in New Mexico, where, juez de aguas, a judge of the waters, would be appointed, by the provincial governor to settle disputes between pueblos and Hispano settlers nearby. And almost always the provisions are for, the indigenous peoples were here first, but what's just and equitable for what people need to be able to survive in New Mexico was also a consideration. So it was never just raw prior appropriation of first and foremost water rights. It was also, these people are sharing the valley anyway, so they were essentially dealing with a reality to try to create shared arrangements.
That seems like a more flexible or pragmatic or process that might be altered in the future as situations change, whereas adjudication it's more of a final say, which I assume makes people more nervous.
Yeah, I think that's how it was taken, is that this is the last opportunity to retain, lose, fight for, or gain water rights of any kind. And I don't begrudge any party for trying to maximize these things. It's no wonder that these adjudication lawsuits sometimes lasted 5 decades, creating the longest running federal cases in U.S. history, because these were high stakes. And for, some of the indigenous sovereign nations here involved, especially when they were never quantified in terms of their water rights, this was the last resource layer where they had some leverage to get some measure of lost justice for land or cultural patrimony or the Indian schooling of their children. I think it became such high stakes because they saw it as the last stand for questions of sovereignty and resource and even the future of their people. So, I think that's critical to understand in these lawsuits.
So if you're an acequia user and you get this letter of judgment,
right?
They say, we can tell that, your great-great-grandfather started using this in 1925. Mm-hmm. Could you then go to the archives or pull out family documents, pull things out to say, no, we've been here using this amount of water since 1783, or is there kind of this archival race to go dig up the oldest water rights you can?
That's exactly right, and I try to delve into that a bit into Unsettled Waters, but I think it created an archival scramble, and whether that archives really was the personal household document, if you were lucky enough to have something like that.
Were those respected?
They're respected if they're genuine, and if people actually have a copy of that. I think part of our struggle here in trying to understand a place like New Mexico is that so much of the what is taken to be history is very much oral history, lived history, an organic one that's lived as opposed to trapped in dusty parchment paper archives that may or may not reflect their understanding. So when a village, dates from 1713, lots of places say, well, that's our priority date is 1713. Whereas the state wanted to parcel the village up to say, but among you individuals, who was first? Yeah. And I think this fundamental misreading of who was first as opposed to, the village is set first because these were deeded trusts where a group of settlers were given an area or settled an area together. So instead of individual ownership acts, these were often communal ownership acts. So you're lucky if you're a Hispano descendant and you have a document that dates to, the 1700s, much less the 1600s, because a lot of that documentation prior to 1680 was burned up in the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. So it's very much trying to adjudicate going from an oral to a written system of documentation, and that's really what creates headaches on all sides, as you might imagine, is trying to find documents that establish these claims. Are they genuine? Can you dig something up from a county clerk from the 19th century that documents at least part of your family name? So people were desperate to find any mention of this, even if at the village level people had a generally good understanding of what they were farming, how much water they needed.
So did the state respect oral tradition, or say archaeology, or kind of other non-documentary sources for these dates?
Yeah, early on I would say less so, and over time, as adjudications unfold in the 20th century, more so. And that's to give them credit for recognizing that, how do I put this, that most of these adjudications really accelerated when New Mexico was in their heyday of water infrastructure build-out, which is really in the 1960s. There's some prior to that, in southern New Mexico, Elephant Butte's fairly early, but there were very few acequias down there. There were some community ditches. But in northern New Mexico, most of this infrastructure, and I try to detail this, is that a lot of these legal lawsuits triggered by the state, well, they carry them out only when they have to, when a new water infrastructure or federal infrastructure project, a dam, new canal system, a reservoir, is being built. And so they have to figure out, okay, wait, if we impound these in a bathtub, who owns each little parcel? And that's part of the consequences of all this.
Is that often then so that's the trigger often of why one basin is going to be adjudicated and another is left on its own for decades?
Unless people are suing each other already. So that, most of the time the state will initiate adjudications, but there are lawsuits, adjudication cases named after the original parties that sued each other. The Zuni area was triggered by lawsuits between private parties. The Mimbres was actually triggered between private parties. So
is that because they saw it coming?
They saw it coming and that there was an active legal dispute. So all it takes is one claimant saying, wait, our water rights have not been afforded here, they're being violated, and then it enters in, and the Attorney General, Office of State Engineer have to become involved as basically active litigants and as co-plaintiffs to the case. So it's hugely complex, but as you might imagine, the scramble to create and find that evidence is also broadly interdisciplinary, and that was the part that also fascinated me in these, is that it's not just a lawsuit. Is that it encumbered, it created and entrained and really cultivated a whole set of expertise on water, regardless of your home discipline, whether you're an archaeologist, an anthropologist, an historian, an engineer, water lawyer. And what's fascinating is that as the state of New Mexico struggled to forge ahead with adjudications, it created this whole phalanx of people that had to be recruited to understand water in all its complexity. And that to me is fascinating.
I did want to mention, a lot of this reminds me of Pablo Bacigalupi's The Water Knife. Have you read that novel?
I have.
I think actually in some previous episode I did mention that book in some context, but for the listeners, it's this kind of post-apocalyptic Southwest suffering from mega droughts, right, where cities are fighting against cities to claim water rights, because if Phoenix gets the water rights instead of Vegas, Phoenix survives and Vegas all dies, right?
Correct.
And so people are being killed and there's spies and all kinds of crazy stuff, but it's all about trying to get water rights. And I don't want to spoil it too much, but there's a rumor in the book. There's this rumor that someone had found some kind of documentation for the oldest water rights possible.
Right.
That would spell either the triumph or the doom of whatever kind of almost semi-sovereign city could find this dusty old document, right?
That's it.
Anyways,
Yeah.
It's pretty wild. I didn't love everything about the book,
Sure.
but I thought that the world it was set in and that premise was pretty awesome.
Yeah.
So you didn't see as much intrigue and literal stabbing in the back and murder and espionage as Pablo Bacigalupi did?
No, in my case, thankfully, most of the conflicts I had were legal and figurative, not literal and physical. But it's not to say that physical conflicts haven't occurred, in the past. That there's obviously violence embedded in any legal policy that's been prescribed by a federal or state entity, because that usually means that there was violence or something that needed to be settled in the first place. I mean, prior appropriation in Colorado was created to prevent, bearded white miners from shooting each other over mining claims and water needed to sluice through, placer mines or claims. So, this entire premise is based on trying to limit violence. But
once you're named in a lawsuit, that suddenly makes it very intimate and personal and emotional for the individual.
Yeah.
Right. So if they're trying to limit interpersonal conflict and violence, in some places maybe they had understandings, they had ways of working through it for the last few decades, and now suddenly it kind of stirs the pot again.
I think that's right. I think there's a troubling danger to formalizing everything on the ground that's informal, and so if adjudication as a legal process tries to indurate or cement some new prescription for the future that seems less flexible, that's less dependent on social relationships and trust or a handshake across ditches or cultures, I think that's where we run into this aspect that adjudication serves as a catalyst for conflict, not as a settler of conflict.
Especially with a resource like water that is not a finite resource that we know every year there will be this exact amount of water, so everyone gets this portion of it. We could have rainy years, we could have very dry years. So that seems to, if I was a small farmer, that's terrifying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think in some ways we've underestimated and really devalued the flexibility and the inherent genius of these systems that have occupied arid spaces across the globe for centuries. If you go from New Mexico, the acequias, if you can find them from New Mexico all the way down to Patagonia. It's an inherent system that makes use of surface water, and I will make a note here, not groundwater.
Yes.
That is not obviously renewable, and it does it in a seasonal and annual way, as opposed to pretending, for example, since we're talking about Western water, that in the 1922 Colorado River Compact that, there's somehow magically 18 million acre feet running in the Colorado based on one record year, and the entire compact gets forged around these fictitious numbers that existed for 1 or 2 years. Yep. And then everyone doesn't want to touch it afterwards. And this comes up even in, fairly advanced water wonk discussions. I was just at the law school up at Colorado Boulder, and people were talking about the Colorado River as an untouchable holy scripture, that if you touched it, it would set the whole thing into conflict again. So we're unwilling to be flexible about these fictitious numbers. And so, as I joke a little bit in the book, there's a natural science and a social science fiction to water that, again, is fascinating if you approach it from a non-legal perspective, is that we like to pretend these things exist, or that we pretend that, groundwater to surface water transitions and transactions and transfers are equivalent in time and space, even if people are retiring groundwater in one place hundreds of miles away from their eventual use as surface water somewhere else. And so these acts that Western states perform, we have to call them out for the kinds of fiction that I think the water knife can actually highlight as somehow absurd.
Yeah.
And we have choices to make, but we're unwilling to treat these numbers as somehow non-fixed, and that water is variable, because then policy would be too difficult. And that to me is a real telling danger sign. And that's where I end with the book, is that if we are to learn anything about these sort of shared arrangements between cultures that pre-existed, the arrival of an Anglo-American legal state trying to award property rights to water users, is that sharing in proportional numbers in these compacts might have to be an arrangement that is acceptable and the order of the day, as opposed to fixed numbers that have never existed.
The state doesn't like that, though.
No.
They want to start a process, finish the process, and move on. This is where I wanted to get kind of in eventually. And for listeners, there's so much in this book that we've glossed over. There's a number of these kind of huge ongoing multi-decade cases that you go through in different chapters. The Amot and Abeta cases, which I found really fascinating. I was fascinated by some of the discussions of identity and conflicted identities, where you have even within a single family who has mixed Hispano and indigenous bloodlines, which in certain regions almost everyone does. And even within a certain family, you had one story where two brothers, one in the adjudication case claimed his native Pueblo identity, the other claimed kind of his Hispano identity, and they fall under different jurisdictions then. There's so much here that I would encourage readers to go to go dig through, because kind of under this incredibly complex legal story are some really fascinating, and some really fascinating human stories. You end the book by saying we need to follow the water, which I find, I think that sounds very good, right? We need to follow the realities of where water is, how much water there is, the contingency of how all that might change tomorrow or in 10 years or 50 years.
Yeah.
So how do, maybe as individuals, but then also as, societies and cities, in practical terms, how do we do that? How do we follow the water?
Yeah, and I want to back up because I think in some ways that could easily be misinterpreted even by me as I was finishing up a first, second, or third draft of the book as somehow this overly romantic notion that, if we just listen to the wisdom of the ancestors, we'll be fine. I don't think that's absolutely true because, we've made water this fundamentally simple substance that occurs in multiple forms, really complicated, and not just through physics, through our treatment of it in law and policy and economics. And so what I mean by following the water is we can't imagine there's anything else but water because of the artificial treatment given to paper water rights versus, and I'm not kidding here, wet water, as engineers like to talk about it. So the idea that you own 3 acre-feet of water, no, only legally and on paper. But what exists in space and time? Well, there may only be 1.3 acres of water on your field. Oops. And I think this notion of following the actual water, what I was trying to get at is that we're going to have to approach water in very different ways. And in terms of a stocking sustainability where we are smart about using the renewable supplies and trying to be flexible about not cementing in these legal scriptures, compacts, and measures that are immeasurably inflexible. I mean, up until a few years ago, I could not capture rain from my roof in a rain barrel here in my garden.
It was against the law?
It was against the law because of the lawsuit, basically, between Colorado and Kansas.
Over the Republican River?
The Republican and the Arkansas River.
You're using a rain barrel was taking water out of the watershed that should have been flowing to Kansas?
Well, this was the theory, right,
wow.
of making it illegal. And this is the sort of absurdity of where we stand with water. So instead of trying to think of what is locally available, it's like, well, you can collect from your roof in any location in the U.S. I mean, even in Tucson and Phoenix, there are water harvesting systems that are in place that people use. But yet, we're willing to think like Powell, right, in connecting a whole watershed and prohibiting other peoples from doing other things when it's legally expedient or politically necessary to do that. So we don't do the right thing in terms of flexible, sustainable measures with water, and we're willing to bend over backwards to make it harder for other people to be sustainable. And so that's really what I mean, is that we have to be conscious that there is only one form of water we're going to be able to use consistently, and that's the renewable supply. And it's not to be a Luddite, because I think there are ideas, and I'm looking at Arizona here in particular, about storing groundwater, using surface water allocations to try to replenish aquifers. Mm-hmm. I think in some ways, if you'd asked me that 10, 15 years ago, I'd be, well, that sounds absurd. Now I'm of the mind that, well, isn't that better than a dam that evaporates 5, 10, 15% of its water supply every year? To store it underground where it would not be evaporated. So I think we're going to have to change our thinking about what infrastructure looks like. It's going to be a lot less visible. But I also think we have to deal with the physical realities of water. If water is neither created nor destroyed in the universe, following the laws of thermodynamics, the second one, then we have to abide by this and think in rational ways, not like engineering innovation. We could create water by doing this, because some of those measures are just too expensive to sustain in the long term.
I always like to give authors a chance to give us a preview of, kind of what this book has led to, or other kind of new projects that you want to let people know about. Yeah,
I mean, I've come at this in a roundabout way because I fell in, frankly, love with New Mexico and New Mexicans and everything about that landscape, over 2 decades ago in the early 90s, and I wanted to come back to it. And I'm always finding creative ways to try to find an excuse to get back down there.
Yeah.
One of the things I really do want to do more locally here in Colorado is look at how prior appropriation, and this is the home of it in terms of trying to treat water access as a kind of private property right, is how the state of Colorado has tried to adapt its 1973 in-stream flow program to put water back into rivers and streams and not let them eternally dry out, and how that's going to change under climate change. So I'm working with a student right now on this small project as sort of a spin-off to try to bring this a little closer to home here in Colorado, some of the lessons that I think New Mexico has to teach us about water. The second thing is a follow-up that will put me back more on, let's say, native sovereign terms and trying to examine what 21st century conservation efforts led by indigenous peoples looks like in material terms, and that means including Bears Ears National Monument and the controversy of its formation and then rescission by the current administration into two smaller units, and what that particular story, along with the Park Service taking over the Valles Caldera, the Blackfeet up in Montana wanting to create their own national park. That's a larger question, and I think that might be the next book project, but I don't know yet. I just know that I'm interested in it. I want to talk to people, and we'll see if I'm even the right person to write that. I think that might be a real strong grounds for a kind of co-authorship and working with native authors to try to create a more holistic picture about what are the terms of this and what will conservation look like in this century in the American West. So
that sounds great.
Thanks.
Well, I wish you a great remainder of the summer, and I hope we cross paths soon.
I'm sure we will, and I'm sure I'll see you out there on the water somewhere too.
Let's hope so.
All right.
All right. Take care, Eric. Thanks.
Thanks, Brendan. I appreciate your time.
Thanks for listening to this episode. Writing Westward is a production of the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. You can find him at Micah, D-A-H-L, Anderson with an O.com. I'll include a link in the episode description. Besides subscribing to the podcast, you can receive regular updates about upcoming episodes by following on Facebook or Twitter. My name is Brendan Rensink, and I serve here as the podcast host, producer, sound engineer, and pretty much everything else. So if you have any praise or critiques, you should probably just send them my way. I'm Associate Director of the Redd Center and an Associate Professor of History here at Brigham Young University. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions about the podcast, the Redd Center, our live-streamed lectures and events, funding opportunities, or anything else. If you have books you think I should consider for an episode, please send them my way. One last plug, I'm also the project manager and general editor of a great digital public history project hosted here at the Redd Center called Intermountain Histories. You can check it out by visiting www.intermountainhistories.org or download the free mobile app by searching Intermountain Histories on your Apple or Android devices. There you can read carefully curated histories of the region, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more. In any case, thanks again for listening to the episode. We'll see you next month.